Okay, today I'm here to share 6 historical lenses that I think can help us re-nuance the world. So, when you look at me, what would you guess about my identity based on the facts that you see in front of you? I'm guessing you might notice, for instance, you might look at my clothes and think, oh, maybe he's American or from the West somewhere. You might look at my accent and think, oh, maybe American. Wedding ring, notice, oh, maybe he's married. If you've played with me on the football field, you might have noticed my Africa tattoo and then know that I have a connection to Africa. But there are many things probably that you wouldn't know about me. So, for instance, you wouldn't know that I was born in Lubumbashi in the Democratic Republic of Congo, then Zaire. You wouldn't know that my parents got their PhDs in African history at Yale and then spent their careers working in Lubumbashi. My father at the university for 37 years. You wouldn't know that I've spent 75% of my life as in Africa. As a child, here's a picture of me. It's probably not the school you envisioned me going to as a kid. And as an adult, I've spent most of my working career in Africa as well, now teaching here at IST in Dar. So I think just like identities, which are complicated, I think the world around us is also very complicated. And yet, you wouldn't know that when you read the history and you look at the news, because in general, there's a lot of things that try to oversimplify complicated realities. So for instance, I think sometimes they oversimplify things in order to promote certain ideologies, in order to marginalize other people, other voices sometimes. Sometimes things are oversimplified to create an us and a them. Sometimes things are oversimplified just because of necessity to package complicated things into a much simpler way for us to take in. But I think that these things are potentially dangerous and that we need to at least be aware that we are doing them. So there's a word called nuance. It's a word that I like a lot, and it's defined here by the Oxford Learner's Dictionary as a very slight difference in meaning, sound, color, or somebody's feelings that is not usually very obvious. And I'm hoping that these 6 tools I'm going to talk you through are going to help us add nuance to a world that very badly needs it, and help us to turn 2D simplifications into 3D realities. So history is an innately human process. That's our first lens. I think we forget that the history of the world around us and the current worlds around us are created by humans, okay? And these are, we need to put humans back into the story. So for instance, when we teach about something like the Defiance Campaign in South Africa, and we look at the work of the African National Congress, they did protests, demonstrations, they burned passes. They took enormous risks and they took challenges upon themselves to try to create change in the world around them. And sometimes we forget that, right? We take the people out of it and we turn them into a poster. And when we forget that there's a person, we forget that those were agentic people who made choices. And they didn't just make one choice, they made choice after choice after choice in order to try to improve the world around them. And I think this is so important because we also need to remember we are also agentic. We also have choice, and we can make choices to change the world around us too. So my first challenge to you is, how can we rehumanize the world? How can we remember the people in the stories and thus renuance the world around us and the stories we read about in the past and in the present? My second lens is, I think it's so important to acknowledge power dynamics in history and in current events. I think that in any historical event, there are people with different, varying levels of power, influence, and agency. Not everyone starts in the same place in any historical moment, and that's really important to understand that. And when we forget that, the narratives shift in potentially dangerous ways. And we need to remember that there are always some people whose voices are silent and how can we give them voice, which we'll talk about later. So this is a lady called Jeannette Rankin. She was the very first woman to serve in the US Congress, and she served in 1916. And there are two important takeaways for me from the story of Jeannette Rankin. One is that she refused to believe that she didn't deserve to have a voice. She believed she needed a voice, and she fought to cross those barriers in society in order to give herself a voice. The second thing is that I didn't know about her until a student of mine wrote about her in her 4,000-word extended essay for the IB. And I think that was so important because that student decided her voice was important to be heard as well. So both the student and Jeannette Rankin had to decide that was an important voice for me to hear about Jeannette Rankin. So here's my challenge to you. Whose stories do we tell? What gives us power and agency in the world around us? What limits our power and agency? And are there barriers to overcome? And can we be part of breaking some of those barriers and telling some of those stories? The third lens is, I think, the importance of understanding context adds a lot of value to knowledge. Without context, we can draw very simplistic, dangerous conclusions. So here's a map of Congo in the middle. And I think to illustrate this, last year I was going through immigration here in Tanzania. And as is often the case when they see that I was born in Congo, people think that's unusual and they ask me about it. So they asked me, and I said, yeah, I grew up in Congo. And this officer responded and said, you know, unlike Tanzania, those people in Congo are very violent. And I was very struck by that comment, not because it's a new comment. I heard it many times growing up when we would go visit the US, people would say, oh, there's so much violence in Congo, why can't they stop fighting? To which my father would usually respond, well, it took us 100 years after independence to fight the biggest war in American history. So Congo's only been independent for 40 years, so give them some time. But in this situation, it makes sense if you only know Congo through the headlines. But the problem is, Congo has context. They have a colonial context under King Leopold, who was a ruthless leader in Congo, very exploitative, caused a lot of violence in Congo. And you have the current reality, which is that in the world, people are fighting over the resources in Eastern Congo in particular, especially things like coltan, which we use in our electronics. And you cannot understand the headline without understanding the past and understanding the present. And I think when you think about that, then the picture looks different and it looks more complicated. For instance, 20 years ago, Congo was in the midst of the Great African War. There were lots of African countries involved in the war. 66 years ago, though, Congo gained independence from Belgium. And 125 years ago, it was under the Congo Free State under King Leopold. So how far do you zoom out when you are deciding what the narrative should look like and what the headline should be? So I think, of course, most Congolese are living very peacefully, right? And they don't want the violence. They didn't choose it. The violence is there because of many other reasons. And so I think it's very important to create context for the discussions that we have. So how can we add context in order to better understand often simplified historical and current event narratives in order to re-nuance the world? The fourth lens is that all history requires selection and interpretation of facts. So when I was in college, I took a class, and only one class I took was in an auditorium like this, and there were over 100 students in it. And I remember sitting sort of up there in the middle, and I was watching, and the intro to psychology professor was talking. And she said, okay, I'm going to show you a video, and it's a party scene, people walking around in a party, and you need to count the number of hats. I said, okay, I got this. So the party happened, and I counted all the hats, and I was very sure I was right. And I was like, I think I have 23. The person next to me said 24. I was like, nope, 23. So then the professor said, raise your hand if you saw the polar bear. And I looked around, and there were like 3 people out of 100 who raised their hands. I certainly did not see the polar bear. So then she replayed the video, and sure enough, there's a man walking across stage in a giant polar bear costume. I did not notice it. Because the thing is, I was looking for hats. I wasn't looking for polar bears. And the thing is, in history and current events, you cannot tell every story. You have to choose. You have to make choices. And because of that, if we are not aware that some voices are not there, those voices can be lost. And this is, I think, very dangerous. We cannot tell every story, but we have to understand that there is a propensity for a single narrative. We like one story, but that's dangerous. So, what is the narrative when you read a headline, when you learn a history? What is the narrative? Who created this narrative? What evidence was used for this narrative? And what evidence was ignored or considered irrelevant to the narrative? So I think, how can we look past the headline, right? And think about what is the narrative and how can we then re-nuance the world by challenging and supporting and adding to those narratives. Okay, lens 5. Hearing from missing voices can totally change the narrative. So my mom tells a story, and it's a story that struck me. She told a story when I was in high school. She told me a story about when she grew up in upstate New York, which is very cold, and they have a lot of deep winter there, which I didn't really know in Congo growing up. But she knew winter, and they played this winter sport called curling, which is a very funny sport in my opinion. But they played curling. And in curling, it's a very polite sport. You're not supposed to cheer, you're not supposed to celebrate, you're supposed to be very polite. And they were playing in this tournament, and there was a team that came in from Canada, and it was an international tournament. And so they had this Canadian team, and the captain of the team, every time the captain of the team did something, everyone on the team would cheer. And they were winning the tournament, and her team were getting more and more frustrated because they felt like these people were being super rude, and it was not cool. So they built up a narrative that these were rude people, and they were being impolite. And then at the awards ceremony at the end, because this team actually wound up winning, the captain of the team stood up to collect the trophy and said, you know what, I just want to explain. I probably have come across as being rude, but there's a little bit more to it. And he took off his hat, and he was bald. And he said, you know, I actually just came out of cancer treatment. And nobody knew if I was even going to survive. And so it's really amazing that I get to be here on this day. And not only I get to be here, but we actually got to win. And that's why we're celebrating. So I apologize if we seemed rude, but that's the story. And my mom said, you know, I learned something that day. I learned that you should never judge people before you know more about their story, because there might be something that totally changes the narrative. So I think we have to really we have to dig. We have to avoid echo chambers that tell us the same thing over and over. I know we want to be right, but we have to be willing to be wrong. And I know that we don't like discordant information because it seems that it doesn't resonate, but actually discordant information is sometimes good for us. It's not bad. And messiness and nuance are really important, not just in history, not just in current events, but in life. And remember, if it's a complicated reality, it's probably a complicated causality. So how can we give voice to missing voices, right, that can shift the narratives around us in order to re-nuance the world? The last lens I want to leave you with is that understanding also carries responsibility. So I think we have a duty to grapple with tough truths, okay? That's important. I think it's important to mention that while some historical perspectives, judgments, and claims are defensible, There are some that are not, but we can still learn from them. That doesn't mean we have to defend them or believe that they're correct. And then sometimes we are very certain. And when we are very certain of things, I think we have an obligation to act on that certainty. And so one of the things that I feel quite certain about is that African history is underrepresented in the world around us, and it needs to be taught more. And I think not just in Africa, but in the world in general, people will benefit from that, from those voices being heard. So one of the things that I've gotten to be involved with, for instance, is coordination between the IB and the Aga Khan Development Network, where we created some resources on African history that will be free and will be delivered and will be written for IB classrooms around the world. And we're hoping that that will help elevate African voices and African history in our IB classrooms. And one of the goals of this resource, we had to write down a rationale. Why do we think this is important? So one goal of this resource is to fill a gap that exists, right? And show African stories have deep significance to the world, highlighting the global significance of African experiences, not just in Africa, but in other places as well. And also, we have to remember African voices are diverse and different. The world of Senegal is very different than the world of Swaziland or Madagascar, but these voices need to be heard. Okay, so where are we so certain that there is an imperative to act in order to re-nuance the world? Okay, so my last story. When I was we were going to South Africa for a conference, and we left London, and the news in London was that Nelson Mandela was on his deathbed. And it was very sad news. When we arrived in Johannesburg, we learned that he had passed away during the flight. And the Xhosa man who was picking us up from the airport, we were chatting about the legacy of Mandela. And he looked back at my little kid at that time, not so little anymore, and he said, maybe he will be the next Mandela. And it brought tears to my eyes, still does today, not because I really want that life for my child. Mandela lived a very difficult life. I don't want that for my child. But I love the fact that he didn't see him like he saw the possibilities of the person in front of him, and that's who he was celebrating. And I think that's amazing. Okay, so I'm leaving you with six lenses. One, innately human process. Let's remember history is innately human. Let's remember power dynamics. Let's remember context, the importance of selecting and interpreting sources, the importance of missing voices, responsibility in the world, and thank you for your attention.